Carrie, let's go live. All right, Madam Chair, we're now live.
Thank you. Happy Friday to all. The State Board will come back to order. Ms. Marumba, would you call the roll, please?
Board Member Durham.
Here.
Board Member Escarcega.
Here.
Board Member Esser.
Here.
Board Member McClellan.
Here.
Board Member Rankin.
Here.
Board Member Schriffel.
She's excused.
And Board Member Schroeder.
Here. So members of the public and colleagues, welcome. And thanks for joining us today. We have a total of 2 pending bills to discuss, which we'll address as separate agenda items. And so first, I'd like to let Mrs. Mello provide us with a brief legislative update. Ms. Mello?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Live exciting news. The budget is completely finished at the Capitol as of this morning. That is in terms of the legislative component of it. The governor still has to sign the bill, but it is now moved entirely through the legislative process and will be on its way to the governor. So that's exciting, I guess. We continue to be a bit uncertain as to how much longer we will be in the legislative session. That is really, it's all related to the federal stimulus funds coming in from the third big federal piece of legislation with all the money, and what the timing of that, and who gets to decide how those dollars are spent. As I'm sure you can imagine, the legislature would like to have a say about how those dollars are spent. And so there's any number of moving pieces and parts that kind of impact their ability to influence that process. One thing I learned just this morning is that the governor has basically signaled that he is going to allow the public health emergency order to expire on June 1st, which has any number of implications, of course, for us as a state, right? But as it relates to the legislative session, it may, and we don't know yet, we're still waiting for clarification, have an impact on the ability of the legislature to not meet successively. Typically, historically, they've had to meet 120 consecutive days. Under a public health emergency, the legal interpretation has been that those days do not have to be consecutive. So we're a little confused, frankly. If we're in the middle of a session and the public health order goes away, or public health emergency, what does that mean? So practically speaking, we may be still continue to meet at the legislature through the middle of June, which is the longest they can go, or they may finish up, adjourn, recess, not sure the right verb, at the end of May, and then come back for a couple of weeks sometime in August or September, with the topic being these federal dollars and how to spend them. But it's all very uncertain right now. So from a timing perspective, we don't, I know less than I do know. So that's not a very effective report, but unfortunately that is the current state of things. In terms of the pace of legislation, it is starting to slow down. The 2 bills we're going to talk about today, I think, will be the final really big substantive K-12 education bills that we'll see this session. I could be wrong. There's always surprises. But I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of additional pieces of legislation that we haven't gone through yet. So the chart that you've got right now that we resend every Friday and that remains live should be a pretty good guide to the scope of the K-12 legislative issues for the session. I'm going to stop there just because we've got a lot to cover today and not a lot of time, unless anyone has any questions about that information or anything, frankly, outside of the 2 pieces of legislation we're about to talk through.
Thank you. Board Member Rankin, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Mello, can you answer a question for me? There's so many education bills. How are the bills chosen that come before us to vote on? Can you answer that for me?
Madam Chair, Board Member Rankin, yes. So the process that the board has chosen to use is we have, there's a designated legislative contact from each party. So we have a Democrat, we have a Republican. Mr. Durham is the Republican, Ms. McClellan is the Democrat. And we meet with them weekly and go through bills that have been introduced, and they decide to make a recommendation to you all as to take a position. Often, and you'll see the vast majority of pieces of legislation, the recommendation is to monitor. We don't proactively bring those before the full board, but they are on the chart, right? So if there's a bill that says recommend monitor on the chart and you're like, oh, I don't know, I think we should oppose or support or whatever, give us a heads up, talk with Steve or with Rebecca or myself or, staff, and we can move that through the process. I think that your ledge contacts do a pretty good job of channeling what they think where you all would want to take a position or not. And I certainly try to do that as well, but I'm not perfect. They, of course, are perfect, but I will take any blame for bills that we may miss. Does that help?
It does. Thank you very much.
Board Member Durham?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jennifer, has the governor given some indication that he's going to make available to the legislature some amount of money to appropriate? I mean, I don't think he has to allow them to appropriate federal funds. So is he relinquishing his control over some of those federal funds to the General Assembly?
Madam Chair, Board Member, Mr. Vice Chair, I think it's maybe not quite that simple, right? So, obviously the federal law around how the funds can be spent and who gets to decide on who the funds are spent matters a great deal. I think there's any number of negotiations going on. These are all, I think, pretty behind closed doors, right? Like there's a very small group of people trying to sort this through. And part of the challenge is we still don't have total information about the restrictions and guidelines around the federal money. You all have that same challenge with the dollars that the department and the board has responsibility for. So does the rest of the state with the federal money. And so they've been kind of hoping that they'd get all that information so that they could then do what I expect will be some sort of a negotiated plan that they'll let us all know about, but they don't have all that information yet. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Colleagues, any other questions from Ms. Mello before we get to our two bills? I see no more hands. Thank you. So let's go ahead and move on to the legislation. Ms. Mello, would you introduce each item, provide us for a brief overview, and then I will open it up for discussion, please.
Yes, Madam Chair. Let's start with House Bill 1295. The title of this bill is concerning creation of a rebuttable presumption in favor of a charter school authoriser's decisions concerning a charter school. So this directly relates to the process that's already in case in the law that you guys have lots of experience dealing with, where if there is a disagreement between a charter school and its authorizer, the authorizer being either the school district or the charter school institute, there's existing statute that allows those disagreements to be brought to the state board for a determination. Under this bill, those things could still be brought to the state board for determination. So it doesn't change that process. What it does do, however, is changes the way that you all evaluate those decisions, right? So essentially it says that if a school district has made the decision using certain criteria, specifically if the school board made its decision based on the fact that there's a likelihood of a conflict with the local Board of Education's existing long-term plans for the school district, or if the school board made its decision considering student enrollment among the schools of the school district, or based on school district financial considerations. So if the district made its decision on those grounds, then the state board would find in favor of the district. I think that it's fair, and I hope neutral to say that those are fairly broad criteria, right? So that those would give school districts a fair amount of latitude, and certainly more latitude than they have right now, I would argue, in making those decisions as it relates to charter schools. And as long as they make it using those criteria, then their decision would essentially be final, because the appeal when it comes to the state board would not be, it wouldn't be a situation where the charter school would have an ability to, most likely to overcome the district's decision based on the legal criteria you all would be required to apply in that decision-making process. The recommendation from your legislative contacts on the bill is to oppose, and I am happy to turn it over to Mr. Durham or Ms. McClellan to talk a little bit more about that or handle it however you'd like, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So before we start our discussion, would one of the two of you be good enough to make a motion and then we can go through a discussion? Either Rebecca or, go ahead.
Sure, Madam Chair, I move to oppose House Bill 21-1295, rebuttable presumption in charter school appeals.
Thank you.
Second.
Proper motion and second from Mr. Durham. So let me just go down the line and give everybody a chance to make comments. Board Member Escarzaga. Do you have questions, comments?
I probably do. I think I would like to hear, I think probably from Member McClellan, because she's probably looked at this bill longer than I have, but what it is that led her to make that recommendation. And then the other, just a question I have, rebuttable presumption sounds very legalese. Does anybody have a legal definition of that here, or is it, I'll just leave it at that. Does anybody have a legal definition of that?
Madam Chair, may I suggest that we allow Julie Tolson to just answer that legal question real quickly?
Yeah, she's
Probably
here.
be helpful.
Oh, there you are.
Here I am. Yeah, it's not an uncommon concept when you're in a situation described that's an appeal, right? The idea that the decision that you're reviewing is presumed to be correct or presumed to be regular. But what it does in this circumstance is it, in particular, it restricts then your discretion because it's saying you have to presume that the district's decision is correct. And because these two pieces work in tandem, so I hate to just answer the question of a rebuttable presumption standing alone. And it says, and that rebuttable presumption is triggered if the district invokes any of these three interests, right? It's sort of long-term plan for the future, enrollment impacts, or fiscal impacts for the district. And so I think what the bill really does is constrain your authority so much it would make it very, very difficult for a charter school to prevail. Right now you've got a reasonably level playing field where you're just evaluating the best interests of students. So it's not just saying, hey, you should give some level of deference to the local decision. It's heightened constraint on your discretion.
Okay, if I can follow up, but when I'm reading here, it says if it was based on at least one of the several specific, it can't just be that district just says, we've decided we don't want any more charters. We've had it, we're done. Because it has to be based on one of those three areas, right? That's what I mean. They go together.
It does. Those are the three areas that trigger that rebuttable presumption. And, it appears to be reasonably broad buckets, I think, is probably one of the bases for the objection. But I don't want to, I'm trying to sort of stay in my own lane here, right? I'm not the
Very good. You answered it. Thank you.
Board Member McClellan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And before you jump off, Ms. Tollison, I might segue back to you for just a moment. When we talk about those broad buckets, in particular, that category that they can deny on that relates to a potential negative impact for enrollment of a nearby school, am I right that fairly effectively gives them some pretty strong carte blanche, particularly in the urban districts where chances are there's a school nearby just about any proposed site in a densely populated area? Or is that something we haven't tested yet?
I mean, we haven't exactly tested, the model in terms of school choice is exactly the notion that some folks may choose to go elsewhere. So I would imagine that's going to be implicated pretty often.
Okay, so then I appreciate Board Member Escarcega's question and the opportunity to share a little bit about why I found this bill concerning. Everyone who's been watching the board lately knows that I haven't been shy about voting in favor of a district decision to deny a charter where that's appropriate and where that is consistent with the best interests of students. But one of the cases that leaps to mind for me in looking at this bill would be the Vega case. And in that case, they had some of the highest growth scores in the state of Colorado, working with a population with high rates of free and reduced lunch eligibility, English language learners, and kids who were in groups that have often been underserved. So I think the concern for me is that we really need to continue to tether our policies with respect to charter applications to what is in the best interests of students. And that really is the strongest sticking point for me in my recommendation for an opposed position. And maybe Mr. Durham would like to expound on his thoughts as well. He may have some of the same and maybe some different reasons for his recommendation.
Board Member Durham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the last time we did any research on charter schools appeals, they'd been judged by the board about 50% of the time for the district and about 50% of the time for the charter schools. The current system actually slightly favors the districts, and that is that the charter must show that the decision of the district was not in the best interests of the students and the community, but that's essentially, that standard is essentially a 50-50 weighing of the evidence. When you have to prove by the preponderance of the evidence, I think the fact is that it really starts to tilt in favor. It shifts the burden of proof certainly farther than it is under the current system. But I think more importantly, because you're considering that for those three new elements, which I think the most problematic was that somehow it's in conflict with the long-range plan of the district. Well, that it would, if it wasn't when it started, they wouldn't be hard for them to have a plan that it would be in conflict with. And you could probably show that in black and white. So a long-range plan doesn't have charter schools, and ergo, this one can't be permitted. So I think it creates a circumstance where if a district wants to deny a charter school, they could construct a set of facts that could not be overcome by an applicant because of the facts we're required to consider, and because of the facts you must give those the weight of a rebuttable presumption.
Thank you. Board Member Escarcega, do you have any more comments or questions?
Well, I would just say, and this is very helpful. When I first saw the bill, when I was looking at it, and I think about like where districts are, some districts in declining enrollment, which has been projected out for a long time, well before COVID, correct? And so COVID may have exacerbated it, but I kind of think about Denver Public Schools, and I would say that, I think they're doubling down on their commitment to choice. They're not looking to, I'm trying to figure out how to word this, they're not looking to decrease or restrict. In fact, they're attempting to expand it so that neighborhood schools are guaranteed choice for every parent. So when I think about that, and I think about what I know they're going through, grappling through, particularly in the far Northeast, some of the testimony we heard last time, there's where I can see them wanting and needing some flexibility. When I fully understand the other parts of the bill, how broad it is, I would have preferred an amend position rather than an oppose. And I really think that's where I'm at. If there were some guardrails put on, I do think that when a district has to consider the whole and has a better on the ground understanding of the whole and all students, not just a small section, I think sometimes they have some good grounds for it, but maybe this bill is too broad for that. I do understand that. So like I said, I wish, as I think about it now, I would have preferred an amend position to it. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Board Member Rankin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have no questions.
4 comments?
No, I have no comments either.
Okay. Board Member Esser?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few things to clarify. As a state board member, I don't always have enough information, and I'm new, to understand exactly the reasoning behind a district local board's decision to deny a charter. So for example, I can assume in a very small district, let's say Garfield 2, and somebody comes in and they want to build a charter for choice reasons, understand completely, because I always think I can do schools better than anybody else myself. But then we split one elementary and neither can function well now because they have less students and can maybe only have 2 classes at each grade level and maybe less than 2 classes, which now becomes a problem. So that's the information I don't have when I make these kind of decisions. And I always fear that we can get in a Southside Chicago situation where you close so many schools that were neighborhood schools that kids were having to travel over an hour on public transportation. So the idea of choice is choice if you have transportation, if you have information, and if there's enough students there for that school to stay open. And it happens on both sides. So that's my question about this bill. And I don't know if that was talked about at all.
Madam Chair.
Board Member Durham?
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I think I don't know how many charter appeals we've heard over the last 6 years that I've participated in, but oftentimes the kind of information you just suggested or just mentioned it certainly can be considered. It often is considered. It depends whether the district believes that's a reasonable thing to raise, and keep in mind that we have to find that their decision was not in the best interest of the community. And I would think a description of having schools essentially without critical mass that you described would be a strong point that their decision was in the best interest of the community. So I think those things get considered, or certainly can, if the district chooses to raise them. And I think we've seen things like that raised in the past, and I suspect we will in the future. So it's up to the district to make its best case as to why it was in the best interest of the children in the community. And it's up to the charter school to make its best case why it's not. And the burden of going forward is in fact on the charter school. So I think we get all that information if the districts think it's relevant.
Thank you, Mr. Durham. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. I'll just add in, if it'll help Board Member Esser, I'm certainly aware of more than one case where a group of parents came forward and said, we really want this particular curriculum for our kids. And instead of creating a separate charter school, they would just create a separate classroom at each grade level. For example, if you wanted Montessori or core knowledge or one of those things, that could be made available within the school itself without breaking apart the entire system and keeping it then a district program, but it would add the curriculum that parents are seeking. And I've seen that in the district where I serve, but I've also seen it in other cases. So those are the kinds of arrangements that can be made, especially in a smaller environment, such as what you described. Board Member McClellan, did you have any more comments to make?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in kind of weighing some of the thoughts that we've all expressed on this bill, one of the concerns I might have is that we really do have an obligation to hear every charter appeal that we hear with an open mind, and weigh the evidence through the prism of what is in the best interest of students, every case. So if we started with the presumption that it's always okay for any school to deny any charter at any juncture, simply because they don't want charters in their district, I think that would fly in the face of the presumption that we've been operating on this whole time, that we're supposed to be making a decision with an open mind, open to all of the evidence, presented with an eye toward what is in the best interests for students. And I think this bill takes us outside of that zone. And I think you all know I've been plenty plain spoken when I'm a vote in favor of the district position. I haven't always voted that way, but enough times to know that I offer this for your consideration in good faith. We really do need to be making our decisions with a clean slate and an open mind, weighing the evidence honestly in the best interests of students. And I think this bill takes us outside of that box. That's why I'll be a yes vote. Thank you.
Thank you. I will also be a yes vote. I appreciate Mr. Durham pointing out that it's been about 50-50. It's been about 50-50 probably for the last 12 or so years. We actually did an analysis one time because the board was accused of being totally one-sided or other-sided. And I really do believe that we look very, very carefully, but to have a presumption in advance of something that is in fact a factor for school districts. There are changes in their funding when there's a charter. There are changes in their enrollment when there's a charter. So it's sort of obvious that that can be brought forward unless they really very much want that charter. And so I really think this is just a little bit, goes a little bit too far. I'd like to call the roll, please. Ms. Maramba?
Board Member Durham.
Yes.
Board Member Skarziga.
No.
Board Member Esser.
No.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder.
Yes.
Passes 4-2 and 1 excused.
Thank you. So the next item today is a discussion on HB 21-1294, K-12 Education Accountability Systems Performance Audit. Ms. Mello.
Thank you. And I remembered to take myself off of mute, so I feel like I'm a winner for the day, right? Okay, I hope that you all have actually taken a chance to read this bill. It's not a super long bill, but there's a lot of substance kind of packed in every word. And we had a good conversation about it earlier this week. And I think it's very important that you all as a board, or whatever decision you come to, whatever reactions you have, are really based on what's in the legislation. And I say that because this has taken a long path, right? So this bill, many of you know, has been out there in one form or another for, gosh, a year and a half now. And the bill that's been introduced that we're considering today is not the same as, the first draft we saw of it 18 months ago. And so, again, whatever decision you all come to is your prerogative, but I want to make sure we're basing it on what's in the legislation right now. And to that end, I am going to spend a little bit more time describing this than I might normally in a bill. I think it's also of an important enough topic that, we want to make sure we've got all the facts on the table for what the legislation actually does. The goal of the legislation, and that I am taking these words from the bill, right? So it's not my analysis or understanding of what the goal is. It's what the bill tells us the goal is to have an independent performance audit of the statewide system of standards and assessments and the statewide accountability system in order to determine whether these systems, there's three things, meet the goals and the intentions that were identified by the General Assembly when those pieces of legislation were adopted, to identify whether or not those systems contain institutional or cultural biases, and whether or not those systems provide accurate, credible, and comparable assessments of public education throughout the state. That's the goal of the legislation as as written. The process, I'm going to have two main lines of conversation with you all today. I hope this is most effective. So I want to tell you a little bit about the process for doing this. And then I want to also make sure to tell you about the substance, like what is it we're studying, right? Because the what we're studying is really a big deal. And I think probably the basis for lots of conclusions or decisions you all may want to make. To start with the process part, the way the bill is constructed is that the state auditor is directed to hire a contractor through a competitive bidding process. That hire must be done no later than October 1st of 2021. So that's what, 6 months from now, give or take. The auditor or the contractor has to complete their work by November 15th of 2022. Clearly that is being timed so that the work is complete and available for public consumption in advance of the 2023 legislative session. The contractor is directed to obtain information from the Department of Education to the greatest extent possible, and to maximize their reliance on previous studies or evaluations. And all of that language is in there to try to keep the cost down, right? Because you can imagine this is a big study asking a lot of big questions, and there could be a lot of big needs for data. And so they're trying to keep it somewhat constrained there. The contractor may request information from schools or districts if that is not available from the Department of Education. So it is possible that our schools and districts would be also would be asked for data. The auditor and the contractor are both very explicitly given access to both student level data and to PII, personally identifiable information data. That is a policy question that you all as a board have been quite active on and involved in and cared a lot about. So I want to make sure to note that. I think you may hear some concerns about that from some of your fellow board members. I would characterize it this way. There's a policy question about whether or not PII is necessary in order to do the work in the bill, right? I don't think that's a black and white yes or no. I think that's different people might answer that different ways. But it might be helpful to think about your discussion around data privacy is what level of information is needed to answer these questions? Do we even need PII? And if we don't need PII, well, then we don't need to authorize its release. That's a possible line of thinking you could go down. If you all decide that you're comfortable with some PII being provided, under certain circumstances, not just, put on a billboard, obviously, but under, all the existing types of protocols that we have in place for that. Your staff, and Julie Tolson can speak to this if need be, would suggest that the FERPA language in the bill is not correct. So it would need to be addressed. So there's kind of two layers to the personal identifiable information conversation. Let me talk, I'm going to try not to go so fast that you can't understand what I'm saying, but also try to give you a lot of information about what this bill is looking at, because it's looking at a lot of things. So bear with me as I try to walk through this. The way it's structured is at a minimum. It does say at a minimum. So in theory, I guess the contractor could come up with some more questions. Given that there are 16 very substantive questions already outlined in the bill, I think it would be unlikely that someone would add things to it, but the bill does allow for that. If any of you are following along in the bill as we go, the questions for the study to answer start on page 5, line 14, and go all the way through page 9, line 6. It's the bulk of the bill. Okay, and this is my shorthanded version of these, really working hard to be accurate. I hope I succeed. The first question, are these systems effective in objectively measuring performance? Second question, does the system identify success effectively and drive effective improvements when they need to happen? Third, and I'm just going in the order that they're in the bill, is the data that is produced by these accountability and assessment systems used by districts in a practical way to both measure effective classroom instruction and school leadership performance? Fourth, within academic achievement, academic growth, or post-secondary workforce readiness, Do the systems we have in place maintain an institutional or cultural bias related to race, ethnicity, religion, sex, sexual orientation, nationality, disability, age, or economic status? That's number 4. The 5th, are the interventions that take place right now under our current accountability system effective at helping schools? And then there's a 6th question that's about, are they effective at helping students? I'm kind of collapsing those into this bullet in hopes of getting through this. 7th, do the outcomes we see reflect inequity and correlate to poverty? The 8th, do low income and students with disabilities have access to the same types of learning opportunities as their higher income peers? I'm starting to lose my numbers here. I'm just going to keep going. Does the system cause districts to shift resources and interventions to different groups of kids? Does the size of student populations disproportionately impact the accuracy and comparability of results? Are outcomes that are measured correlated to the way a school is effective in teaching skills or capacities that families may find relevant or do find relevant? Are participation rates on tests impacting results? Does the growth model meet the statutory requirements? Does the system provide a credible basis for comparing schools and districts? Within the assessment and accountability systems, is information about those systems accessible to all the different audiences, parents, students, teachers, in a way they can understand, and in a language, when particularly language as parents and their families can understand? And finally, does the system identify schools and districts that are struggling to serve particular groups of students? And does it, and are the interventions that are being used to better serve those groups of students working? Thank you for your patience. I know that was a lot. I would suggest one that somebody else get to talk for a little bit, because I think you would all appreciate that. And I want to turn it over to Mr. Durham and Ms. McClellan momentarily. We could talk about this bill for 17 weeks is my guess, right? There's so much here, there's so much substance, there's a lot going on. I think the 2 areas where you might want to make sure you have a chance to talk about, and there could be others, are around those data privacy issues, and particularly the study questions around bias and how I think you'll hear some feedback that, well, certain openness to looking at bias, right? Like nobody is for bias. I've never heard any statement that anybody in this meeting thinks bias is a good thing. But are the way the questions phrased, are we going to actually get at that information? So I'll highlight those as maybe potential places to start. Madam Chair, I turn it back to you to guide our discussion.
Thank you. Before we begin, I'm sorry, I'm getting back sounds. Either Board Member McClellan or Mr. Durham, could we have a motion, please? And then we'll move forward. Mr. Durham, are you ready to make a motion?
Yes, I move that we monitor, or that we, we work to amend this bill to make sure that it reflects the current state of affairs and what we can legitimately expect to get from testing, and to protect the personally identifiable information of our students.
Thank you. That's a proper motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All right, I will go down the line. Colleagues, Board Member Esser, questions, comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Particularly, thank you for starting with me. If I may, I'd like to address Alyssa Pearson, the Deputy Commissioner.
Ms. Pearson, hi.
Hi. Ms. Pearson, can you explain to me what you would recommend we amend around the bias statements?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you, Board Member Esser. On page, I just want to make sure we're all grounded. Page 6, letter D. I think it's the fourth element in here. This is a conversation we've been having a lot with the sponsors of the bill and other people, trying to understand what the intent really is and where we're trying to understand about bias in the systems. So the way it's written right now, it does allow for more components than the three, than academic achievement, growth, and post-secondary workforce readiness. It does allow for that, but those are explicit in there. And I think the concern, the technical concern, is that if we're focused on academic achievement or growth or post-secondary workforce readiness and looking for bias, that's not where I think we'd find bias. I think those things will show correlation. Those are outcome measures, and they'll show correlations with data. And we've already done those studies. We know that there is a correlation, not a perfect correlation, but there is a correlation between achievement and poverty rates of schools. But that won't tell us what about the system might have bias in it. So I think the recommendation and the thinking is, let's go to where we might see that, to understand if that's what is creating the different outcomes that we see. And so is it in our standards? Is it in our assessment questions? Is it in the weighting of how we weight growth and achievement in accountability in the frameworks? So I think the suggestion would be to look at those, to be more explicit that those are the components where we want to analyze and see if the bias is, and instead of stopping at where the correlation might be. Does that make sense, or get at what you were asking?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That I'm glad I asked you, because that's clearer than going back and forth in writing through through email. So I understand it better now, how you plan. Is that doable? Is that type of audit doable, looking at your growth measures, how it's weighted?
I think so. I mean, personally, I think this is an overwhelming, like, these questions are huge. They're enormous. There are some really important questions in here, but they are really large. But I don't think looking at that level is any more challenging than some of the other questions to figure out how to analyze and come to conclusion on. Okay.
And then I'm not sure who to address this to, Madam Chair. The personal information that can be identified, what are we looking at there? What exactly is this situation with how an individual child could be identified?
I will give a general answer if that's okay, because this is, one where we could get super technical. But I think the issue is that the bill very explicitly says if the contractor decides that they want that kind of information, and I'll just, Vivian Mello, 8th grade, what did she get on her CMAS math test, right? That under this bill, they would have access to that information. I think the question is whether in order to answer the questions, do they need to know that Vivian Mello, grade 8, got the CMAS score, or do they need to know that the female students with all the other demographic issue that attends who went to that school got these scores, right? And I don't want to speak for your staff, but again, this can be a super technical issue, so I'm trying to maybe keep us at a good policy level conversation. That aggregated information, the 10 female students in the 8th grade scored this, I think we could see being useful and important information for the type of work the study is contemplating. We don't necessarily see the need for knowing how Vivian Mello did.
So how would we amend it?
And I don't have specific language in front of you. We can certainly come up with that, but I think it would be a conversation with the sponsors to say, again, we're not trying to say you shouldn't have access to data, but let's make it the appropriate access of data. And so you could put language in there that either says, no PII, just because we make a judgment that that's not needed, or if for some reason they think they need the PII, there could be some sort of way of determining whether that actually is necessary or not, or there's other ways to meet that information need before we go to that as a default. But Alyssa, please, Alyssa or Katie or Julie Tolson or any other number of people, if I have said something really wrong on behalf of CDE staff, please correct me now.
No, I mean, I will just say, I think Ms. Tolleson has advised us that, you know, there may need to be some actual technical fixes to the FERPA language that's actually not correct right now. So I think we're working on that as well.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. And Ms. Pearson.
I think
Board Member, go ahead.
the bill is, I'm trying to remember the exact language, but I think it keeps the general language, the audit statute, which allows them to subpoena any data we have, which, so for Ms. Mello's daughter could include disciplinary, absenteeism, all kinds of things on a personal basis that she may not want disclosed to third parties. And so I think that there's certainly no objection to providing all the aggregate data necessary for them to do their job. I think there are lots of reasons not to allow particularly a third-party independent contractor to have access to all of the kinds of sensitive information. I mean, we get lots of data from school districts about individual students. It's maintained on an individual basis. We aggregate it, I think, before we disclose it to anyone. And that's, I think, that's appropriate. So we need to, I think we can confine them to aggregate data.
Thank you. Board Member Skarzica?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have no problem with the amended position. I think that makes sense from what I'm hearing. And as far as the PII data, really, honestly, I would have to see exactly the analysis that they're asking to do to make a determination if they really need aggregate or student level. No, they shouldn't just have carte blanche. I agree. That just sounds, you know, we should make them work a little bit more for that. There is a process they could come through, I guess, with us for some of the PII. If it gets questionable, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But it would really be hard for me to say, here's the exact language right now until I know exactly the technical analysis that they want to conduct, right? So maybe some room for them to come back, perhaps. I think when I go back to the question that Dr. Esser asked about the bias piece in here in your amended language, and this would be for Ms. Pearson. So like as an example for the first one, the academic achievement as determined by the process to review state assessment questions. Can you explain that? The process to review questions. And the reason why I asked is even last night I was on this great webinar, the racist history of standardized testing. And it's far more than just review of questions. It has to do with the development and the technical analysis of the questions, which questions end up being deemed to be appropriate, included, to include, and then what does that lead to on outcomes, right? And I'm getting down in the weeds, but to you, is this going to answer the question, are our standardized assessments biased?
Thank you, Board Member Skarzica, Madam Chair. I think that's the language that you had that we shared with you. That's draft language and can definitely get adjusted. It was just kind of a starting point that some people had been working on around it. That first question about the process, and Ms. Zurkowski is on, and she can add more detail if I miss it. But there's a very clear process of going through each of our assessment questions and how the assessment is developed to test for bias. It's part of our federal approval process for our state assessments. And so really looking at, does that process catch? Is that process sufficient? Is it catching bias? That's what that question, that suggested language was about.
Okay, so it's not just, it's the technical bias review, I think, is what I'm looking for, not a subjective, here's a group of individuals. I've done that work, actually. Take a visual look at this and tell me if you think it's biased without the statistics behind it to see what it's actually doing, right? If it's all of it, if we're able to look at all of it, then I think that makes, it makes more sense. And then the only other point I would make is that I think from what it was first explained, we can, with these questions, I don't want to say the recommended language adding, which would define some of these questions better. If it narrows them too far, it still sounded like the bill, this, as Mello mentioned, Ms. Mello, they could still go beyond it and ask more, right? So we're not saying this is all they can do, but this is some language to help focus. That's what I heard. And okay, all right, thanks.
Board Member McClellan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I couldn't help but drag some of my municipal experience in here when I was on city council, and again when I first joined the board. We've seen data requests that are so broad that you almost wanted to go back to the person requesting the data and ask them, have you made up your mind what you're looking for, or are you just going to have our staff chase their tails? And that's why you see agencies so very often charge by the page to make sure that we get a targeted and intelligent data request, rather than one that is so broad that it paralyzes part of our staff. So I wanted to give Ms. Tollison a chance to kind of weigh in with her take on whether or not this bill, as it is currently written, places us in a difficult position with respect to our obligations around FERPA, and whether there are things that we might be able to ask for that could help us to more reasonably hone the data requests in a way that allows us to be compliant with FERPA and to protect PII.
Sure, I have thought through that a little bit, because there's two different sides to this coin, right? One is whether you just say, look, we don't want a bill that provides for access to that student level PII at all, then FERPA is just not an issue. But if you've got where there's going to be some access, I'm going to take a quick moment. I know we don't tend to do that in these, but see if I can actually pull off to sharing.
Good job.
All right.
Good job.
So here's what they have in there so far, which is, and this is at the bottom of page 9 of the bill, where they're basically saying, hey, CDE, you will designate the state auditor and its contractor as school officials who have legitimate educational interests in all your records. And so really what it is this directive to, from the outset, simply give them this unfettered access. Two concerns here. One relates to the policy judgment for you all, right? Which is how much do we want to constrain access to PII on principle. But from a legal side, I'm going to switch screens again here and see if I pull this off. I want to show you why we have flagged this as a particular problem. Have I succeeded again in showing you a slide?
You are,
I'm so proud.
You're rocking.
So here's how the school official exception works. And this is why it makes me nervous just wearing my lawyer hat. Here's what the school official exception's about. It's when schools and districts outsource certain services to third parties and designate them as school officials. So school resource officers, the therapist that helps your threat assessment team, the volunteers who go out and assist with talking to families around truancy, whatever those things may be. They're performing an institutional service that you'd otherwise use your employees for. They're under your direct control. And most importantly, looking at the last bullet, they have been identified for families in advance through your annual notification of FERPA rights, saying, hey, families, we have certain people or groups of people, types of people that we use for outside services. These school officials might have access to your kids' data. Well, you can see all the ways that this doesn't fit here, right? Because we've got, this isn't an institutional service. They're not doing a CDE function. This is an outside audit. They're not going to be under your direct control. Families haven't received an annual notification in advance that, hey, we've got this school official who might be assisting us with some programs and have access to your kids' data. It's just a complete square peg for the whole project. So I don't really see how you all or CDE can do what the bill's proposing, without being in very dangerous land in terms of FERPA. So if you all were simply saying, we just want to take and amend a position to fix the legal FERPA question, right, which is the only part of this that's in my lane, we've mentioned, well, then at least use the auditor evaluation exception. I know this is a long answer to your question, Board Member McClellan. Thanks for indulging me, because then we know that you designate
but they tell us we do have those problems and we ought to do something about them. So hopefully this bill can be amended to put an appropriate emphasis on what's going to be, I suspect, at least $1 million worth of taxpayer money at work.
Thank you. Board Member Rankin?
I have a lot of issues with this bill, and I don't know if there are enough amendments to clear it up. With 16 issues in a bill, that right there is very questionable to me. What are we trying to get at here? If we throw 16 things at it, maybe 3 will stick. I'm not sure where this was. We've got 16 laser focused issues and a shotgun approach. That's kind of the way I look at this. PII, of course, we've already discussed that, and I would concur with that. State testing, this is a federal thing. If we were in the wrong there or missing the mark, I don't know what we can do besides change to a different test. So I think I have more questions than amendments can solve on this. I've never seen a bill that has so many issues into one bill. So I don't know how this can help with, again, outcomes, but also how to zero in on really what the issues are with the individual students. So that's all I have.
Thank you. So my thoughts are we doing the right thing with looking at our standards, assessments, and accountability system? And it probably is the right thing to do, to evaluate, to take a look at what we've been doing. Are we doing it with this bill the right way? No. Number one, I'm not sure what the problem is that we're trying to solve. And as Board Member Rankin said, there's so many things in here that it actually gets kind of confusing. One of my biggest concerns in going through all those is that there are a number of them, at least 2. I'm not very good at reading bills, but there are 2 of them, C and I, that are actually questions of the school district. Did they use, as a result of their performance evaluation, what did they do? Did they allocate resources? Did they do this or did they do that? It's clear to me in any auditor trying to answer these questions that the data is not going to all come from CDE, whether it's masked or whether it's PII or whatever it is. In order to answer the questions, the auditor is going to have to go back to school districts. I anticipate a huge blow up when these districts find out all the information that they are being asked. How did you allocate resources to those kids identified based on the performance assessments? So this is kind of a mishmash. A lot of questions, not super clear, but they do go back to the districts, which in fact have local control. And I don't think our legislature has been telling them how they respond, how they should respond to the results. I find that super, super problematic. And I'm not sure that folks really get that part. I'm very comfortable with having an analysis done of our standards, our assessments, our model to see if there is some kind of bias. That's not something I know myself that I can evaluate. I think it's important. There are folks that believe there are biases in there, so let's let somebody take a look at that. Having been a board member and on the state board for so many years, I can assure you that if we start giving out private student information to anyone, we are breaking the trust that we have earned with our public, that the Department of Education and that our policies will protect student information. This has been an ongoing issue. It's not been in the press and in the legislature as much recently, but it has been a huge issue, and we've tried, I think, really hard to be able to collect the data that is needed for decision making in a way that we don't have to expose student data. Frankly, I can visualize the emails that I'm going to be getting. I can even identify a few of the folks that I know will be on my case as soon as this bill in this form would be signed. It would scare the heck out of a lot of parents. So yes, I think we should have an emphatic look at this bill. My recommendation would be, in addition to the PII issue and the clarity of where we are looking for bias, whereas the notion that just because something correlates doesn't mean it's biased. We should also see if we can get the bill folks to focus on their questions so that it is really clear what is the information that they need and why do they feel that that information would be helpful. I support the notion, but this is not ready for prime time in my opinion. So unless there are further comments, I am ready to have Ms. Maramba call the vote. Colleagues, yes? Okay, Ms. Maramba.
Okay, Board Member Durham.
Yes.
Board Member Skarziga.
Yes.
Board Member Esser.
Yes.
Board Member McCullen.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
No.
Board Member Shuffle is excused, sorry, and Board Member Schroeder.
Yes,
So that passes 5-1 and 1 excused.
thank you. Unless any of you have something else, I would say we stand in adjournment until May 12th at the time of our regular board meeting. Yes?
Thank you all. That was a really thoughtful and substantive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mello. Thanks
Have a
all.
good day.
Thank you. Happy Friday. Bye.
Bye.